He was born in Versailles. Gold-trimmed rooms. Servants who bowed at his every step. At 4 years old, he became heir to the throne of France. By 8, he was an orphan. By 10, he was dead. Alone in a filthy cell, his body covered in sores, his belly swollen from starvation, calling out for a mother who had been executed months earlier. And then, during the autopsy, a doctor slipped the boy's heart into his pocket and walked out of the prison. That heart would be stolen, lost, recovered, passed between royal exiles for 2 centuries, and finally tested for DNA in the year 2000, 205 years after the boy died. The results confirmed what the revolutionaries had tried so desperately to bury. The child who died in that cell was Louis XVII, the lost king of France. This is the story of Louis Charles de France, the boy who inherited a revolution instead of a crown. Louis Charles was born on March 27, 1785, at the Palace of Versailles. 101 cannon shots announced his arrival. He was the second son of King Louis XVII and Queen Marie Antoinette, and from his first breath he lived in a world of impossible luxury. Crystal chandeliers, silk curtains, an army of nursemaids and governesses attending to his every need. He was described as a beautiful child, blonde curls falling to his shoulders, large blue eyes, a cheerful disposition that charmed everyone who met him. His mother adored him. She called him her child d'amour, her little cabbage of love. Unlike his sickly older brother, Louis Joseph, who suffered from a curvature of the spine and constant illness, Louis Charles was robust and full of life. But France in 1785 was already beginning to crack. The treasury was empty. The harvests were failing. The common people were starving while the aristocracy danced at Versailles. Within 4 years, everything would collapse. In June 1789, Louis Charles's older brother died of tuberculosis. He was 7 years old. Louis Charles, now 4, became the Dauphin, the heir to the throne of France. 5 weeks later, the Bastille fell. The French Revolution had begun. The royal family's world shrank with terrifying speed. In October 1789, a mob of women marched from Paris to Versailles demanding bread. They invaded the palace. Marie Antoinette barely escaped through a secret passage as the crowd broke into her bedchamber. The family was forced to relocate to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, effectively prisoners in their own capital. For 3 years, the family lived in a strange limbo, still technically royal, but surrounded by guards and watched constantly. Louis Charles continued his education. He played in the gardens. He seemed, by some accounts, to adapt to the new circumstances better than his parents. He was still a child. He did not yet understand what was coming. On June 20th, 1791, the family attempted to escape. Disguised as servants, they fled Paris in the middle of the night, hoping to reach the Austrian border and the protection of Marie Antoinette's relatives. They were recognized at Varennes, arrested, and brought back to Paris in disgrace. Whatever remaining goodwill the people had for their king evaporated that night. On August 10th, 1792, the Tuileries was stormed. The Swiss guards were massacred. The royal family fled to the Legislative Assembly, and from there they were transferred to the Temple, a medieval fortress in the heart of Paris that would become their prison. Louis Charles was 7 years old. The Temple was cold, damp, and deliberately humiliating. The family was housed in the Tower Keep, stripped of most of their servants, watched around the clock. Louis XVII was separated from his wife and children. He was allowed to see them only at mealtimes. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVII was executed by guillotine before a crowd of thousands in the Place de la Révolution. Louis Charles, now 8 years old, automatically became Louis CSET's men in the eyes of royalists across Europe. To the revolutionaries, he was simply Louis Capet, a dangerous symbol that needed to be neutralized. For a time, Louis Charles remained with his mother, his sister Marie Thérèse, and his aunt Madame Elisabeth. Marie Antoinette clung to her children. She taught Louis Charles his lessons. She tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy in the shadow of her husband's execution. But the Committee of Public Safety had other plans. On July 3rd, 1793, guards came for Louis Charles. The boy was to be removed from his mother's care and placed under a new guardian, a man who would re-educate him in revolutionary principles. Marie Antoinette fought them. She refused to let go. The struggle lasted over an hour. Finally, the guards threatened to kill both children if she did not comply. She released her son's hand. Louis Charles screamed and cried as they dragged him away. He begged to stay with his mother. Marie Antoinette collapsed. She would never see her son again. The man assigned to re-educate the Dauphin was Antoine Simon, a cobbler and radical revolutionary. His job was simple: destroy any trace of royalty in the boy and transform him into a model citizen of the Republic. Simon's methods were brutal. He cut off Louis Charles's golden curls. He dressed him in revolutionary clothing, a red cap, a carmagnole jacket. He taught him to sing obscene songs mocking the king and queen. He forced him to drink alcohol until the 8-year-old was stumbling drunk. He beat the boy when he cried. But the worst was yet to come. Jacques Hebert, one of the most radical voices in the revolutionary government, needed ammunition against Marie Antoinette. Her trial was approaching. The revolutionaries wanted her dead, but they needed charges that would shock the public and justify execution. Under Simon's supervision, Louis Charles was manipulated into signing a statement accusing his mother of sexual abuse. The charge was incest. An 8-year-old boy, drunk and terrified, was made to testify that his own mother had molested him. When this accusation was read at Marie Antoinette's trial on October 14, 1793, the Queen refused to respond at first. When pressed, she finally said, "If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge laid against a mother. I appeal to all mothers who may be here." The women in the courtroom, who had come to watch the hated Queen be condemned, fell silent. Even they found the charge repulsive. But it didn't matter. 2 days later, on October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was executed. Louis Charles was never told his mother was dead. For months afterward, he continued to ask about her. In January 1794, Antoine Simon was reassigned. Louis Charles, now 8.5 years old, was placed in solitary confinement. The door to his cell was bricked up, leaving only a small hatch through which food could be passed. For 6 months, no one entered the room. No one cleaned it. No one spoke to the boy inside. When officials finally opened the cell in the summer of 1794, they found a child who could barely move. He was covered in tumors and sores. His joints were swollen with rickets. He had stopped speaking almost entirely. The golden-haired boy who had charmed Versailles was now a skeletal, mute creature who flinched at human touch. A new guardian, Jean-Jacques Christophe Laurent, was assigned to care for him. Laurent was horrified by what he found. He tried to improve the boy's conditions, but it was too late. The damage was irreversible. On June 6, 1795, a physician named Philippe John Pelletan examined Louis Charles and found him gravely ill. His limbs were wasted. His stomach was distended. He suffered from chronic diarrhea and could barely keep food down. Pelletan had the boy moved to a room with a window, hoping fresh air might help. It didn't. Throughout his final days, Louis Charles drifted in and out of consciousness. He hallucinated. He heard music that wasn't there. He called out for his mother, still not knowing she was dead. When his keeper asked where he was hurting, the boy pointed to his heart. On June 8, 1795, at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Louis Charles died. He was 10 years old. He had spent 2 years in prison. He had been separated from his mother for nearly 2 years. He died without knowing what had happened to any of his family. The revolution had destroyed him. Not with a guillotine, but with neglect, isolation, and systematic cruelty. The following day, June 9, 1795, Dr. Pelletan performed an autopsy on the body. Officially, the cause of death was tuberculosis complicated by neglect. The report noted the extensive physical damage the boy had suffered, tumors on his wrists, knees, and other joints, severe malnutrition, signs of prolonged abuse. But Pelletan did something that night that would change history. Following an old tradition of preserving royal hearts, Pelletan secretly removed the boy's heart during the autopsy. He wrapped it in a handkerchief, slipped it into his pocket, and walked out of the temple prison. He placed the heart in a crystal urn filled with distilled wine to preserve it. The rest of Louis Charles' body was buried without ceremony in a mass grave at the nearby St. Marguerite Cemetery. No marker, no monument. The revolutionaries wanted him forgotten. But they couldn't erase what Peloton had taken. Over the next 2 centuries, the heart of Louis XVII has passed through more hands than any relic should. The alcohol in the urn evaporated, the heart dried and mummified. It was stolen during a robbery. It was recovered. It was passed to the Archbishop of Paris, then to the Spanish branch of the Bourbon family, then to Austria, then back to France. Throughout this time, a strange phenomenon emerged, people claiming to be the lost Dauphin. The mystery began almost immediately after Louis Charles's death. No one who had known him as a happy child at Versailles ever saw him in his final years. The official records were vague. The burial was secret. Rumors spread that the boy had been smuggled out of the temple and replaced with another child, a sick boy who died in his place while the real Louis XVII escaped to safety. Over 100 people eventually claimed to be Louis XVII. A German clockmaker named Karl Wilhelm Naundorf was the most persistent. He convinced the boy's childhood governess that he shared memories only the real Dauphin would know. His descendants still use the name Bourbon today. A Native American missionary from Wisconsin named Eleazar Williams claimed he was the lost king. Even Mark Twain referenced the phenomenon in Huckleberry Finn, where a con artist pretends to be the little boy dolphin. For 2 centuries, the question remained. Did Louis XVII really die in the temple, or did he escape? In 1999, the French government authorized DNA testing on the mummified heart. Scientists compared mitochondrial DNA from the heart to samples from Marie Antoinette's hair and from living descendants of her sisters. The results, announced in 2000, were conclusive. The heart belonged to someone in Marie Antoinette's direct maternal line. The boy who died in the temple prison on June 8, 1795, was her biological son. Louis XVII had not escaped. He had died exactly where the record said he died, alone, abandoned, and 10 years old. The pretenders were all frauds. The escape theories were all fantasies. The truth was far more terrible. A child had been tortured to death by a revolution that claimed to stand for liberty, equality, and fraternity. On June 8, 2004, exactly 209 years after his death, Louis XVII finally received the burial he had been denied. In a ceremony at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional burial place of French kings, the crystal urn containing the boy's heart was carried into the cathedral. Cardinals presided. Royal descendants from across Europe attended. Trumpets sounded. For one afternoon, France acknowledged the child it had tried to forget. The heart was placed in a niche near the graves of his parents, Louis XVII and Marie Antoinette. The family was finally reunited, or as reunited as they could ever be. The boy's body remains lost, somewhere in the mass graves of Paris. Only his heart came home. Cardinal Jean Honoré, who delivered the sermon, compared Louis Charles's suffering to that of modern victims of child abuse. He called the boy a pawn of sadistic captors. He noted that the revolution, which claimed to be building a new world of freedom, had destroyed an innocent child in the process. Louis XVII Civid never ruled. He never wore a crown. He never signed a decree or commanded an army. His entire reign existed only in the imagination of royalists who recognized him as king while he sat in a prison cell. But his story endures because it reveals something that revolutions would prefer to forget, that grand ideals can produce monstrous cruelty, that political movements can destroy children in the name of progress, and that some crimes are so terrible they take 2 centuries to acknowledge. The Bourbon dynasty would return to France after Napoleon's fall. Louis XVII, the dead king's uncle, took the throne in 1814. When offered Peloton's heart, he refused it. He couldn't bring himself to believe it was real. He couldn't face what had been done to his nephew. Today, visitors to the Basilica of Saint-Denis can see the crystal urn containing Louis XVII's heart. It sits beneath a medallion showing the boy's face. Young, innocent, with the curls that Antoine Simon cut off in 1793. Nearby are the tombs of centuries of French kings, Clovis, Charlemagne, Louis XRV, the Sun King himself. Among them rests the heart of a child who inherited a revolution instead of a kingdom. He was born to rule. He died in a cell. And for 209 years, even his heart couldn't find peace. If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing. We explore the rise and fall of history's most powerful dynasties, one bloodline at a time.